Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I visited the Clinton Library on one of my cross-country journeys a few years ago, and I was really excited about it. And I'm thrilled to be in Arkansas again. My name is Brad Herzog. I am an author. I live in California. I am an author of several dozen books, and I'm going to talk quite a bit about that today. But I'm going to start out actually by embarrassing myself. This is a photo of me from 1979 at my summer camp in northern Wisconsin. I had a full head of hair. I had little Buddy Holly glasses, and I swear to you, at the other end of that fishing line, I had a huge fish. It was actually the biggest fish caught all summer at the summer camp. Unfortunately, there's no photo to prove it. Nobody thought I'd taken a picture of the darn fish. But that's okay. Think of all the possibilities at the other end of that line. You can use your imagination, and that's really what I'm going to talk about today is creative possibilities. I am a writer, which obviously can mean a lot of different things, and I represent a bunch of them. I began my career actually as a sports writer for a very small newspaper in Ithaca, New York, and I wrote hundreds of newspaper articles. I've been a freelance writer, my own boss, working at home, pitching ideas to magazine editors and book publishers for about 25 years now. And I've written for scores of magazine articles for dozens of magazines, Sports Illustrated, Reader's Digest, the airline magazines in the seat pocket in front of you on an airplane. And I've written for quite a few of those, which is great because the reader's not going anywhere. They got to read something. So I really enjoy writing for that. But I haven't only done newspaper articles and magazine articles. I've dabbled in writing poems and short stories and movie screenplays. And I've also written more than 30 books for adults, for kids, fiction, nonfiction, picture books, chapter books. This isn't even half the books I've written. Quite a few, sort of jack of all trades. You can finish that sentence, but the point is I do a lot of different kinds of writing. So as a writer, I'm often asked about the writing process. When do you write? How do you write? Where do you write? Which are all valid questions. But that ignores half the battle when you're trying to craft a literary masterpiece, and that is simply, what the heck are you going to write about? Good writing begins with a great idea. It begins with an idea so compelling that an editor or a publisher can't pass it up. An idea so intriguing that a reader can't pass it by. When you're leafing through a magazine, you're not really stopping on an article because of the writing. You're stopping because of the idea, the subject matter. An idea so compelling that it might actually make a student actually enthusiastic about writing. It's my job to catch those ideas, and wherever they come from, and turn them into something delicious. So I thought I'd take you on a little fishing expedition regarding my creative process, which may offer some insight into the spectrum of possibilities out there. So I'll start this way. Who has seen the movie Castaway starring Tom Hanks? Seen that? Okay. I happen to love that movie. My wife despises that movie. I really love it. If you don't know what it is, it's Tom Hanks works for FedEx, and he's on a plane that crashes into an ocean, and he's stranded on a deserted island, and he has to figure out a way to survive. That's basically the whole movie. And eventually, FedEx boxes start washing ashore, and he starts opening them to see what might be in there that might be useful. In one box, he finds they show him removing sort of a mesh and leather dress out of one of the boxes. And as the viewer, you're thinking, well, that's useless. But in the very next scene, you see that he's taking that mesh material and has created a fishing net out of it, and he's able to catch fish and eat for the first time on the island. So basically, he turned the mundane into the miraculous. And that's essentially what I try to do as a writer. Anything in my daily existence, my mundane daily existence, can be creative fodder for a story or for a clever idea. You just have to tilt your head at the world a little bit, and often for me, that simply means that I wonder out loud. Anything I look at, anything I come across, I wonder about. I question everything. A piece of advice often given to young writers is write what you know. And that's very valid because it makes sense, because knowledge about a particular subject breeds confidence. And confidence is absolutely the most important attribute that a writer can have. A writer with confidence in his or her skills and subject matter uses a stronger voice, takes more chances, crafts a more compelling story. But I often enjoy writing about what I don't know. I like writing about what I would like to know about. So often that consists of wondering out loud, questioning things that I come across in my everyday existence. One great example is I was once tying my shoe, something we've all done thousands of times. And suddenly I wondered, who designed the Nike swoosh? This iconic logo that's everywhere in the world, somebody designed it. So I looked into it and I talked to the woman who designed it. She was in 1971, she was a graphic design student in Oregon, and Phil Knight was just starting Nike, and he asked her to design something, and she came up with that. You know how much she was paid for that? $35. Yeah. She later got stock options. She's fine. Don't worry. But so I thought that was interesting. Speaking of underpaid jobs, I'm a father, and when my sons were much younger, I fed them a lot of baby food, and I was walking through the grocery store, the baby food aisle, and I thought to myself, who is the Gerber Baby? That drawing has been on this jar since 1928. Some little child posed for that drawing. And there were rumors over the years, it's Katharine Hepburn, it's Bob Dole, there's all these rumors. Well, it isn't. It actually turns out that it's a woman named Ann Turner Cook. Doesn't that look like the Gerber Baby? She's now a 90-something self-published mystery writer in Tampa, Florida, but she'll always be the world's most famous baby. So what I did is I combined those two ideas, the Nike swoosh and the Gerber Baby. And I wrote a magazine article for one of those airline magazines about the origins of our most iconic advertising images over the years. The Michelin Man, the NBC Peacock, the Morton Salt Girl. And it all started with me just looking at my shoes and looking at walking through the grocery store. So ideas can come from anywhere. It's just my job to grab them when they come to me. I question everything, and when you do that, you just might embark on an interesting search for an answer. I've written magazine articles revolving around questions like, what is it like to drive the Oscar Mayer Wienermobile? You know, what is that like? It's a 30-foot long hot dog that you're driving along the highway. How do you parallel park a hot dog? What is that like? So I interviewed a guy who drives that, and the Hershey's Kissmobile, and the Planters Peanutmobile, and wrote about it. Now, it wasn't a very important story, but I thought it would be fun, so I did it, and it wound up being the cover of one of those U.S. Airways magazine. So I was just watching TV one day, saw an Oscar Mayer Wienermobile, and thought, I think I want to write about that. I was once watching Willy Wonka, the original Willy Wonka in the Chocolate Factory. And I thought to myself, whatever happened to that actor who played Charlie Bucket in that movie? I've never seen him in anything else. What happened to him? So I found him and interviewed him. And it's a really nice man named Peter Ostrom. He lives in upstate. He's a veterinarian in upstate New York. He didn't like making movies. That was the only movie he ever made. But I wrote about him because I wondered. I love the learning experience, even if I thought I knew everything about the subject. I've written about a dozen alphabet rhyming picture books for kids about various sports. One's called S is for Save the Planet, about how to protect the environment. I have one coming out that I'm really excited about next spring that is going to be called W is for Welcome, a celebration of America's diversity. That's going to be great. But most of mine are about sports, and my best-selling one is actually H is for Home Run, about baseball. And when I was doing that book, I thought, well, trust me, I know everything there is to know about baseball. But I decided to do some research anyway. And I found out things that I didn't know that I put in the book. For example, the shape of home plate is a 5-sided pentagon, right? In the earliest days of baseball in the 1840s and 1850s, it actually wasn't that shape. It was a circle. It was a dinner plate. That's why they call it home plate. Who knew, right? So I put that in the book. So I'm always learning something new every time, and that drives me as a writer, is just wondering and learning new things. All right, back to fishing. When we're pursuing good ideas, many of us are essentially fishing in the same spot. It might be the popular spot of the moment, but at some point there's a diminishing return. Your creative hook sort of gets lost in the crowd. At some point you want to find your own unique place to drop your line. I always hope to do that. One way I like to do that is by surprising the reader, by introducing the unexpected, by making people rethink things. I like to counter conventional wisdom. And I've done that in many different ways. One example is I wrote an article about the most famous misquotes in history. By that I mean, for example, take this guy, for instance. In none of the 44 stories that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote about Sherlock Holmes did his famous detective ever actually say, "Elementary, my dear Watson." He said elementary, he said, "My dear Watson." He never actually put the two together. That came later in the movies. He never said it. Or this guy, Captain Kirk. In none of the original 79 Star Trek episodes did he ever actually utter the 4 words, "Beam me up, Scotty." People think that would be on his tombstone. He never actually said those 4 words. Another example is James Cagney. In none of his movies did he ever actually say, "You dirty rat." He said worse things, but he never said that. I decided to put those together and write a magazine article about it. And if I can get my readers to sort of react like you're reacting, that's a little surprise from that, that's a victory for my idea. I'll give you another example. I once wrote about a study that my old college psychology professor did. I love it because it's all about countering conventional wisdom. What he did was he examined, his name is Professor Tom Gilovich, I'll give him a shout out. He examined Olympic medalists, in their reaction immediately after their event, and then on the medal stand. So when they found out where they finished, and then when they were standing on the medal stand. And he had neutral observers rate their reactions. And what he discovered is on the whole, bronze medalists are actually more satisfied than silver medalists. It depends who you're comparing yourself to. It actually comes from an old Jerry Seinfeld bit. I wish I could imitate his voice. I cannot, but I'll try to do the bit. Basically, the bit is that he says, you know, if you think about it, when you win the gold, you feel good. You won the gold medal. If you win the bronze, you think, well, at least I got something. But if you win the silver, it's sort of like, congratulations, you almost won. Out of all the losers, you're the #1 loser. Now that's funny, but there's also some sort of a profundity to that about who we compare ourselves to. So I thought it was an interesting story. So I wrote about that concept. It's countering conventional wisdom. I always feel that if the world expects you to zig and then you come up with a concept that sort of zags, it's always more compelling. Okay, another fish story. This fellow right here is my dad. This is 1979 as well. His name is actually Bud. When he taught me how to fish, he always told me that when you get that first little nibble at the end of your fishing line, don't immediately jerk your fishing rod, you're going to lose the fish. Wait till it nibbles a harder bite, and then you can reel it in when you really got the fish hooked. The analogy for creativity, to apply that to creativity, is don't jump the gun on your idea. Explore it a little, let it percolate a little bit. In other words, basically find the real story. A good example of that is I was once reading a sports encyclopedia. And by the way, the fine print is my favorite thing. That's where I get some of my best ideas. Everybody else ignores it. It's sort of why I like staying up late to write. Everyone else is sleeping. All the ideas are out there for the taking for me. I love reading the fine print. I get some ideas there. I was reading the fine print of a sports encyclopedia, and I came across a list of intercollegiate tennis champions throughout the years. And I saw that the 1892 tennis champion was a guy named Bill Larned, who was a student at Cornell University. Now, I happen to graduate from Cornell University, and I've written for the Alumni magazine for 25 years now. So any story I come across that has any peripheral attachment to Cornell, my eyes open. And especially if there's a sports story. We don't have a huge amount of sports champions at Cornell University. So I thought, okay, this will be a good story for the magazine. But I still didn't think there had to be something more. So I did my research, and it turns out that I didn't realize that Bill Larned is actually a Hall of Fame tennis player. He actually, after he graduated, won 7 national titles. And over the course of 20 years, he was ranked in the top 10 in the world, 19 of those 20 years, which is a remarkable record of longevity. So I thought, okay, it's a Hall of Fame guy. This is a bigger sports story, better sports story. But then I wondered, what happened in that 1 year that he wasn't ranked in the top 10? It was right in the middle of his career. Why did that happen? Well, it turns out that was the year 1898. And it was the year of the Spanish-American War, and the reason he wasn't ranked was because he was one of Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders. Suddenly, it's a completely different story. It's not a story about a tennis player. It's a story about a guy who was part of one of the most famous military regiments in history, who rushed San Juan Hill during the Spanish-American War with a future president, a group of outlaws and Ivy Leaguers that meshed together to make this heroic attempt. The line about him being the 1892 tennis champion was one line of the story. I found the real story. And that article was published back in 1998 on the 100th anniversary of the Spanish-American War, which brings me right to my next tip for catching creative ideas, which is basically timing is everything. I always pay attention to the calendar. Not only the year, but the month, anything that is the proper hook for a story. I always try to remember anniversaries. In general, as a husband, that's a pretty important tip. But as a writer, that's also really useful. For instance, I knew back in around the year 2011, I started thinking that 2012 was going to be the 100th anniversary of the sinking of the Titanic. And I wonder what new story can I find regarding that? And since I do all these stories for Cornell Alumni Magazine, I wonder if there are any graduates from Cornell who were on that boat. Turns out there were 4 of them. 2 of them survived and 2 of them didn't. So I wrote a story about those 4 people that was published, and it was easy to sell the editors on that story because it was the 100th anniversary of the Titanic. The following year, I published this book. It's one of my all-time favorite picture books that I've written. It's called Francis and Eddie. It tells a true story of 20-year-old Francis we met. If anyone has seen a Disney movie from about a dozen years ago called The Greatest Game Ever Played, golf movie, starring Shia LaBeouf. Am I pronouncing that right? It's a Disney story about that, but I always thought it should be a children's book. It's a true story. What happened was Francis we met lived in Brookline, Massachusetts, across the street from the Country Club, one of the first country clubs in the nation. And he was from a not wealthy family, wasn't a member of the Country Club, wasn't even allowed to play on that golf course. But that was across literally 100 yards from his house. But he would sneak on in the dark or in the rain when no one else was playing with the one golf club that he owned, and he'd find lost golf balls, and he taught himself how to play golf that way. And by the time he was 20, he became so good that he actually qualified for the U.S. Open that was played on that golf course in 1913. All the greatest golfers from all over the world converged on that golf course across the street from his house, and unknown, tall, lanky, 20-year-old Francis we met was one of them. His regular caddy that he caddied for him at other places wouldn't even carry his bag for him because he went with some French pro he thought would make some money. The only person who offered to carry his bag for him was a little 10-year-old boy named Eddie Lowry, who lived nearby. And Francis said, "Eddie, my bag's bigger than you, but okay, fine, go ahead." Everybody made fun of them, this little sort of strange pairing of walking around the U.S. Open. And Francis hit his first shot. It was a terrible shot, and not a single person followed him to watch his second shot. Nobody cared. By the end of the 4 rounds, however, 10,000 people were following Francis and Eddie because they had tied for first place with the 2 greatest golfers in the world. One of them being Harry Vardon. If anyone's played golf, you hold a golf club like this. It's called the Vardon Grip. That's one of the guys he tied with. He won 6 British Opens. He's a Hall of Famer. So Francis and Eddie were going to be in a playoff the next day against Harry Vardon and Ted Ray, the 2 most famous golfers in the world. 15,000 people were following them around the course. Right before it started, the country club members took Francis aside and said, "You have to change caddies. This is the U.S. Open. You need an adult helping you around the course. You need to get rid of Eddie." And Eddie was crying in a corner, and Francis looked at Eddie and said, "Nope, I'm sticking with Eddie. I've got the man I want on my back." So Francis and Eddie went around the course that day, and spoiler alert, they won the whole thing. I think it's the greatest story in sports history. This unknown golfer and his 10-year-old caddy win the U.S. Open. I didn't even tell you all the best parts of the story, but Francis and Eddie. Francis is in the Golf Hall of Fame. Eddie wound up moving to California, becoming a multimillionaire. And by the way, when I was actually launching this book, I did it at a municipal golf course near my house in Pacific Grove, California. And the day before, I got a call from someone, and he let me know that Eddie Lowry is actually buried 100 yards from where I was doing my book launch, and I had no idea. I thought that was crazy. But anyway, every time I talk about that story, and I figured there's a 10-year-old at the heart of the story, how could that not be a picture book for 10-year-olds? Every time I talk about it, I say I think it's the greatest sports story ever told. But then I would always add, unless the Chicago Cubs ever win the World Series. Lo and behold, I'm originally from Chicago. In 2016, a good thing that happened in November of 2016 was that the Chicago Cubs won the World Series for the first time in 108 years, which is almost statistically impossible. And immediately after the 2016 World Series, my publisher, Sleeping Bear Press in Michigan, for whom I've done about 17 or 18 books, asked me to write a picture book about the curse of the billy goat, the supposed tale behind the team's long history of misery. So we published a book last June called Murphy's Ticket about this goat named Murphy, who the owner tried to take him into the 1945 World Series, and the usher said that, there's a lot of different stories, but the usher said that the goat smelled bad, he couldn't have a seat, and the guy said, I curse the Cubs, and they'll never win again, the Bums will never win again. And they didn't win for another, I don't know, 79 years after that or something. But it's a great story, and I wrote it in the rhyme scheme of Casey at the Bat, and I sort of take the reader through the history, the ups and downs and miseries and the glory. It's the subtext, the subtitle is The Goofy Start and Glorious End of the Chicago Cubs Billy Goat Curse. So I love it. It's an adorable book. It's possibly my favorite picture book I've written. But again, the timing was good. We put it out right after the Cubs won the World Series. And we did it quickly. But of course, timing isn't always a celebration. This is a book I wrote a few years ago called My Mantelpiece. As many of you probably know, in the summer of 1964, famously known as Freedom Summer, hundreds of northern college students volunteered in Mississippi in an attempt to register African American voters and help change the segregationist culture of the state. It was a dangerous mission, and on the very first day of the summer, it turned tragic as the Ku Klux Klan murdered 3 volunteers. If you've ever seen the movie Mississippi Burning, it was a fictionalized account of that. One of those victims was a 20-year-old from New York named Andy Goodman. I wrote a magazine article years ago about his mother, Carolyn Goodman, who was a Cornell graduate, and I wrote a story about her and how she devoted her life to making sure her son did not die in vain. She became this sort of civil rights icon herself. And after I wrote the article and she liked it, she asked me to co-author her memoirs. And she's the first family member ever to tell that story in a book. We spent a great deal of time together, and she told me her story, and although she passed away in 2007, I was able to complete the manuscript and publish it on the 50th anniversary of Freedom Summer in 2014. The foreword of the book is actually written by the great Maya Angelou, who died about 3 weeks after the book came out. I think it's possibly her last words in print. So I'm very proud of that. But the point is, I try to tell the right tale at the right time. We told that story 50 years later, and they were down there. It was all about voting rights. Certainly, the timing was correct on that as well. Okay, fishing again. Sometimes, back to a more humorous bent. Sometimes timing can mean patience. Writing like fishing can be a case of waiting and waiting and waiting until you get a notion or a nibble. And sometimes you have to be really patient. In fact, I'm reminded of what comedian Stephen Wright once said. He said, there's a fine line between fishing and just standing on the shore like an idiot. But it's true. Patience can be a virtue, particularly when you're trying to be creative. In fact, sometimes it can really help you find the right angle. And that's really what I always try to do with any story that I'm writing. I try to find the right angle. Here's a good example of that one. Several years ago, I found out something that I thought was kind of funny. Believe it or not, there are actually professional miniature golfers. It's not their full-time job, but they actually travel to tournaments around the country, and you can win about $3,000 or $5,000 for winning a miniature golf tournament. Before you all decide to switch careers, they're really good. They usually get a hole-in-one. The worst they ever get is a 2. But I thought that was kind of funny. It would make a good magazine article. Professional miniature golfers? Wow. But I thought it needed more. I thought I needed a better angle to make that a compelling story. And then I found out that there's actually an event that takes place every September in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, called the Masters of Miniature Golf. It's the national championship of miniature golf. All the greatest mini golfers from all over the world converge and compete for the national championship. I thought, okay, that's a better way to tell the story. That's a nice structure for the story. I can write about that event. I still thought maybe there's something more compelling that I could do. So then I thought, well, what if I actually compete in the tournament? What if I try to win the Masters of miniature golf and then write about that? Sort of my Walter Mitty account of competing in the Masters of miniature golf. So I convinced the magazine to send me to South Carolina. I convinced the tournament to allow me into the tournament, which wasn't that difficult. And there were actually 31 people in the tournament. 28 of them were basically professional miniature golfers, really good. 2 of them were a couple of grandparents on vacation in Myrtle Beach who entered the tournament, and 1 was myself. I'm not terrible at golf, and I actually got a hole-in-one on my first 2 holes. And I started thinking, I'm going to win this thing. Forget the story, I'm going to win this thing. Well, it turns out after 72 holes were played, out of the 31 golfers, I finished 31st. The grandparents beat me. They kicked my butt. They were better than they looked. But now, while that was embarrassing, I really did try to win. It was one of the best stories I've ever written, was about how I finished in last place in the national championship. Rule number 1 of writing is show, don't tell. Anytime you can find a compelling way to show the reader something rather than just talking it through with them, rather than just talking at them, sort of, it's a better way to tell a story. So instead of me telling the reader how intense this competition was, how good these miniature golfers actually were, I showed them in a funny and compelling way by showing how bad I was compared to them. It was a much better way to tell the story. That was my story about finishing in last place. Which brings up another great way to spur a great idea, which is basically this: participate. Anytime I can participate, that I think helps my story. I like it because these first-person stories allow me to inject humor into my writing, often making fun of myself. If something happens to me and I think someone might like to read about it, then I'll write about it. In fact, the first story I ever published anywhere for my high school newspaper was an account of how I got to spend one game, along with my twin brother Brian, as a bat boy for the Chicago White Sox baseball team. This was way back in 1983. Here's a picture, in fact. Talk about embarrassing. I'm the guy on the left with all the hair and the funny glasses. That's me. It's called an awkward stage. I had this, it was a thrill for me, and one of the first things I thought after that experience was, I want to write about this, which was a pretty good indication that maybe I was going to be a writer someday. But even at that young age, I realized that a really good way to tell a story is to try to tell it in a surprising way. So I didn't want to just say, hey, guess what? I was a bat boy, met my favorite players in the dugout, sat there giggling nervously for 2.5 hours. It was a lot of fun. I wanted to tell it in an interesting way. So the way I told the story was, it turns out that the date that I was the bat boy was May 26th, 1983. And on that day, the Chicago White Sox were the worst team in baseball. They were in last place. They were terrible. They had won, I think, 16 out of their first 40 games. However, from that day on that season, they were the best team in baseball. They won their division by 20 games. They made it to the playoffs for the first time in decades. They almost made it to the World Series. And the day they turned their whole season around, went from worst to best, was the day that I was the bat boy. So obviously, the article I had to write for my high school newspaper was how it was all because of me. I was the MVP of the Chicago White Sox. Of course, I didn't mean that, but it was a fun way to tell the story, and in an interesting way. And I saw it got published in my high school newspaper. I saw my name, my byline was in the newspaper by Brad Herzog. I wanted to see my name everywhere. I thought I want to be a writer. So that really sparked me. But that was this first-person account of this one experience I had. Many years later, in the spring of the year 2000, at the peak of the cultural phenomenon, when there were 25 million people watching this show on TV every night, I somehow wound up as a contestant on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. If you remember what a phenomenon that was before there were 1,000 TV channels, whatever the #1 show is right now, double the amount of people, that's how many people were watching in those days. It was crazy. And here I was, flown to New York, sitting in a TV studio, all dark all around me, strange music playing, 500 people sitting in a circle around me, little tiny man named Regis Philbin sitting 4 feet across from me, asking me these strange questions for gobs of money, and 25 million people watching on TV. I mean, that is a strange experience. And I was the first writer to ever be on that show. So a lot of people want to know what that experience was like. So I wrote several articles about what it was like to be on that show. This is a picture of me on the show. I did not win $1 million. I did pretty good. I did pretty well, I should say. But it's all relative. I don't want to talk about it. And by the way, the woman in the background there who's very excited with her mouth open there, that's my wife. And I just have to say this, the woman sitting next to her name is Julie. She was in the hot seat right before me on the same show. The crazy thing about that is we're good friends. I've known her husband since I was 9 years old. And we were on the same show. It's like a 1 in a billion occurrence. So I wrote about that a little bit too. I also used that experience as the sort of introduction to one of my books that I'm going to talk about because it was relevant to what I was writing about. So that was my quest to win $1 million. And some of the greatest stories in literary history have been quests of some sort. Whether we're talking about Odysseus or Percy Jackson or anything in between. Anything can become a quest. Anyone can embark on an adventure, a journey of discovery. And among my books of which I'm most proud are my 3 American travel memoirs for adults. And each one was a quest of a different kind. It all began with me looking through the pages of an atlas and sort of the fine print of the atlas. And I noticed that there were a bunch of small towns with interesting names. And I began to wonder what exactly is out there. What stories are waiting to be told in these tiny little towns? What lessons can be learned? I have a theory about the way Americans describe ourselves that it's inadequate. Our metaphors are inadequate. I don't like a melting pot. I feel like that implies like an evaporation of flavors. That doesn't make sense to me. I don't really like a patchwork quilt that implies that, what about all the little threads that make up each clashing subculture? What I think the best way to describe America, or at least a good way to describe America, is that as a masterpiece of the painting technique known as pointillism, a dot painting. If you look at a dot painting from a distance, all the dots blend together to form an image. If you look up closely, each one, some are bigger than others, some are bolder than others, each one has its own little story to tell. And that's what I think about of small-town America, the little towns that dot America. In my trilogy of travel memoirs, I examine the big picture by traveling through some of the tiniest dots on the map. I develop a theme, an overarching concept that I would like to explore, and then I would craft a cross-country journey that took me through towns with names that fit that theme. My hope is that by the end of the trip, all the little lessons learned along the way coalesce into this grand epiphany, a greater understanding of the world. My first 2 travel memoirs were essentially an examination of the State of the Union. The first one was called States of Mind. And the story behind this is that I turned to my wife, Amy. We were living in Chicago in the middle of the winter. We had just been married, and we both had kind of starter jobs in Chicago. And I turned to her and said, how would you like to quit your job? And we'll scrape up all our money to put a down payment on a big old RV, and we'll travel around the country for a year, and I'll try to write a book about it. And to my surprise, she turned to me and she said, sure. So then we had to do it. And we had this magical unbelievable year where we traveled through 48 states, saw dozens of national parks. I say that we saw everything there is to see in the country, but that's not true. You never run out of things to see. But it was this incredible journey. We wound up moving to California, a small town in California. But the backbone of this journey was a visit to 18 tiny little hamlets named after virtues. And I was trying to find the literal and that figurative. I was trying to find out, is there love in Love, Virginia? Can we find honor in Honor, Michigan? Harmony, California. Wisdom, Montana. Pride, Alabama. Hope, it wasn't Hope, Arkansas. It was Hope, Mississippi. And this was pre-internet. So I didn't know anything about, I couldn't find anything about these little towns of 100 or 200 people. The only one I knew actually a little bit about was Hope, Mississippi, because I knew that it was next, I saw that it was next to Philadelphia, Mississippi, which is where those 3 civil rights workers were murdered in 1964. I thought, what a fascinating juxtaposition. There's a town next door called Hope. So we went to these places trying to see if we could find a story there. And it turns out that if any good writer, you can go to a town of 100 people and come away with 100 stories. And they kept being these amazing stories. I mean, Justice, West Virginia, a town of 600 people in Logan County, West Virginia. All I knew about that one was that the Hatfields and the McCoys were from that area, West Virginia. And I thought, wow, that would be neat if I could find something having to do with those warring families from the 19th century. We got to Justice, West Virginia, through all these down these mountain roads. First sign I saw after the Welcome to Justice sign was Vote Hatfield for Sheriff. Turns out everyone in that town is a direct descendant of the Hatfields and the McCoys, and they all get along now, but every town had a story like that. So that was States of Mind. And by the way, it was published 10 months before I was on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. It wasn't selling very well. A very small publisher published it. All the New York houses said, we think it's well written, but we don't think it'll sell, which is a really frustrating thing to hear. I was on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. Regis Philbin, they do a little pre-interview with you so they have information about you. And he said, so you've written a few books. Tell me about your latest book. So I described my book for 40 seconds, and within 24 hours, it was the 7th best-selling book on Amazon.com. And then I was on a Today Show, and my wife and I were on Oprah a month later. I was semi-famous for like a month before it all came plummeting back down to earth. So that was States of Mind. My second travel memoir was called Small World, and this was, I took this trip in the summer of 2002 alone for about 50 days. Not long after the September 11th attacks. And I wanted to examine the ties that bind Americans, even though we're all so different, and the wonders in our own backyard that we sometimes miss out on. So I decided to go through towns named after these grand international cities. London, Wisconsin, and Paris, Kentucky, and Rome, Oregon, and Moscow, Maine, and Jerusalem, Arkansas. And trying to find the wonders there, basically. And again, everywhere I went, I found great stories of different types of people that I think deserve to be written about. Ranchers in Rome, Oregon, and a woman who collected outhouses in Amsterdam, Montana. And I spent a weekend at a nudist campground in Athens, New York. Actually came away with poison ivy, which was a lot of fun. But again, it was a journey of discovery. And as all good writing is, it was a quest. In my third travel memoir, that was even more literally the case. I was invited to my college reunion. Cornell University is located in Ithaca, New York, which made me think of the story of the ancient story of the Odyssey, the tale of King Odysseus, trying to return home to his island of Ithaca after the Trojan War. And along the way, he encounters all sorts of gods and monsters, but it's really the story of one man trying to find his way. It's the original hero's journey. So as I headed toward my college reunion, I took stock of my own life, as people often do when they're heading to a reunion, and I wondered, how heroic has it been? So I decided to embark on my own would-be hero's journey, a cross-country trip to Ithaca through towns with names straight out of Greek mythology. And I called the book Turn Left at the Trojan Horse. I went through little hamlets called Athena and Apollo and Iliad and Sparta, and I met heroes of all kinds, teachers and soldiers and volunteer firefighters. And my goal was not only to examine my own journey and the lives of the people I met, but also to examine all of us, anyone wondering whether theirs has been a life well lived. I would describe it as the memoir of the everyman searching for the hero within. That'll be the tagline on the movie poster when Brad Pitt plays me in the movie. So it's sort of the ultimate example of the idea as a quest. And really, every idea is a quest of some sort. A quest to turn creativity into something compelling. Which brings me to my last path to a good idea, which is apply your imagination. Like most writers, I'm overflowing with ideas, so many that I actually started my own little publishing company called Why Not Books, that comes from a famous quote from playwright George Bernard Shaw, who said, you see things and you say why, but I dream things that never were, and I say, why not? Actually, let me get it. It's my favorite quote about imagination, and I'm convinced that kids have better imaginations than adults. So when I write for kids, I try to view the world through their eyes. It helps that I have a pretty immature sense of humor, but it's useful. And many years ago, for example, I was asked by an educational publisher to write a novel specifically for fifth graders. And the assignment was make it 120 pages long and make it funny. That's it. And that's actually a hard assignment. 120 pages was about 24,000 words. 24,000 words of funny is not easy. Believe it or not, they only gave me about 2 weeks to write this book, which is absurd. And I was panicking. I thought, what's a good idea? I was walking around my house thinking, what's a good idea? What's funny? What's funny? Couldn't think of anything. Walked into my kitchen, got something to eat, opened the fridge, closed the fridge. You know, when you open it, the light turns on, and you close it, the light turns off. That gave me an idea. I wrote a book called Freddy in the Fridge, about a little man who's 8 inches tall, lives in the fridge, sleeps on a cottage cheese. His only job is to turn that light on and off every time. So that's what popped into my head when I opened the fridge. I got that idea because I was hungry. That's it. He follows a kid to school, creates all kinds of trouble. It's a pretty funny book, but it's because I was hungry. When you sort of have an open door policy toward imagination, regarding imagination, it can knock at any time. And kids most certainly have that. And I know that because I'm going to sort of end this with a dad brag of sorts. When I was a kid, I read a book that changed my life. It was called The Hobbit. I loved the book, The Lord of the Rings, all those books. I loved them. I loved that whole world. What I was most amazed by, though, was that J.R.R. Tolkien, the man who wrote the book, started with a blank piece of paper and created a whole world out of his own imagination. He invented languages and histories and family trees and drew maps and 4,000 years of history, but he started with a blank piece of paper. And that's what sparked my notion of maybe I'd like to do that someday. In fact, when I was 12, I tried to write my own fantasy novel, and I got about 2 pages into it, and I quit because I was 12 years old. My son, Luke, when he was 9 years old, he read The Hobbit, and he said, Dad, I think I want to try and write a fantasy book. I said, sure, Luke, go ahead. I thought he would quit just like I did, but he didn't quit. He sat down, and he started writing longhand into spiral notebooks, and after 18 months, he filled 3 spiral notebooks, and he wrote 40,000 words. And at some point, my wife and I said, if you finish this book, we'll find a way to publish this. So actually, the very first book published by Why Not Books was Dragon Valley, a 200-page fantasy novel by Luke Herzog. It was written when he was 9 and 10 years old. It was published on his 11th birthday. It's about these 5 baby dragons spawned in a laboratory and set free in a valley, and it's about the 1,000 years of their evolution and the magic they discover, the battles that they fight. One of the dragons turns out to not be a good dragon, and kids love the book. In fact, Luke got a lot of attention. He was interviewed by our local TV station. He had a book signing event at the local library, and 150 people showed up. He was a little profile in Time magazine for kids. And then he started selling the book to kids all over the country. And he started getting emails from them saying, it's my favorite book. I've read it 5 times. I did a book report about it. Someone sent a photo they took of a sculpture they made of one of his dragons. And then they started asking, when are you going to write your next book? Which is a lot to ask of an 11-year-old. But of course, he started right away. And that took him 2 years. And that was a 300-page fantasy novel called Griffin Blade and the Bronze Finger, about a young, kind-hearted thief named Griffin Blade who goes on a quest with a dwarf and an elf and a minotaur and a genie, and they have to find these 4 precious gems to basically save the world. It's really good, just about as good as any adult could write. I know I'm biased, but that was his second book, and we're about to actually publish his 3rd book. He's almost 17 years old. He's involved in theater and choir, and he's got a girlfriend. He's a little distracted, but he's written a bunch of short stories that are sci-fi and fantasy, sort of Arthur C. Clarke and Edgar Allan Poe type stories. He calls it his angsty phase. But we're going to collect those stories and publish it in a book called Continuum. So this is a boy who had the dedication and imagination to the willingness to apply his imagination, basically, which I think is a key to no matter how old you are, a key to good writing and good the genesis of good ideas. So one way or another, everyone can find a good story. And sometimes when you're fishing for creative ideas, you catch something really special, a keeper. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes all you catch is something like this. That's it. But that's okay. Not everything is going to work, but the most important thing to remember, I believe, is that imagination is never a losing proposition. Always, always the attempt at conceiving and developing and conveying an idea, the simple pursuit of creativity, is a triumphant act. So that's what I'd like to leave you with. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Brad, for that. We do have time for a couple questions, so raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you.
Anyone have any questions?
Bob, right here.
Is this thing on? Yes, okay. I'm not sure I can phrase this quite right, but how can you apply the kind of creativity you're talking about? You seem to have had as big as a blank canvas. I mean, I know you had pressures and stuff, but what if you have to write about a particular subject in a very constrained, environment? Like, for example, when I worked, I wrote about mostly, it was supposed to be expository, persuasive, but it was heavily regulated corner of the financial industry. Something I'm going to be doing in the future for free, so I guess the pressure's not that bad, involves very particular history. Like, how do you translate this good stuff to that constrained stuff?
Well, that's more in the writing, I would say. One of the things I often say, and there are teachers who disagree with me, but I believe sometimes the kids are taught to write in a manner that's often a little bit too rigid. That I think first you have to inspire them to want to write, to want to be creative, and then you could sort of get into the nuts and bolts of it. And like that H is for Home Run book that I showed you, that was dedicated to my 4th grade teacher, because he's the teacher who showed me that writing could be fun, that it could be creative. If you are constrained, I talked about the educational publisher that I wrote that Freddie in the Fridge book for. I also wrote a bunch of other books for educational publishers, little picture books, and I often found it difficult because it was so constrained. It was often very specific. I had to use a certain number of words ending in OUS, or it was leveled reading. I had to be very careful about every word I put in there, and it does sort of suck the creativity out a little bit. But I think within the writing, you can sometimes write something in a way that is creative in and of itself, just within the writing, like how I told my Bat Boy story from that goofy perspective. Obviously, you can't do that when you're talking about history or something serious, but you can have a voice. That's what I'm trying to say. Thank you. You can have a voice, and your voice, that creativity can be reflected in the voice that you use. And how you write it, the voice is reflected in the writing, and it also, it drives the writing as well. So, any other questions?
Over here.
I was wondering if you'd mentioned it in your talk. Your next book sounds like W is for welcome. Is that right? Right. And you mentioned it briefly, but could you talk a little bit more about it, or kind of the nature of the story, to the degree that you're able to or comfortable to? Maybe you're not.
I think I'm allowed to talk about it. So my next picture book is going to be, I think it's coming out in the spring of 2018, I think. It's called W is for Welcome, and a celebration of America's diversity, and it's basically a celebration of the challenges and achievements of immigrants. And I don't believe it should be a statement, but apparently that is a statement these days. And so it's, what we did was what I do in these books is I write a poem for each letter of the alphabet, and then it's called a 2-tiered format, where there's sidebars on the side of each page. It's about 150 more words for older readers. So 6-year-olds can read the poems, 9-year-olds can read the sidebars. You could grow with the book as you grow as a reader. So my job when I put together these books is it's putting a puzzle together, because I have to use every letter of the alphabet, and I want to use every aspect that I think is important about immigrants or the environment or baseball or whatever I'm writing about. Obviously, some letters are really easy. Some, X and Q and Z just drive me crazy. I know like 3 X words. I've written about 12 alphabet books. I have to be creative, but I did X marks the spot of Plymouth Rock, where the original refugees arrived. I did, I think Q is for a quest about the different reasons why immigrants come to America. So I'm sort of trying to cover all the bases of not only the nuts and bolts, like V is for visa, or O is for oath, but also sort of the more general ideas. C and D were a joint spread, culture and diversity. It's fun to put that puzzle together. And the cool thing they're doing with that book is that instead of using one illustrator, they're using illustrations from all their past books that apply to that particular thing I'm talking about. So there's about 20 different illustrators as well, many of them first generation Americans. So I'm really excited about it.
Are they doing a new illustration?
No, it's a one that they are using in old illustrations. I think there were 2 or 3 where they had to commission a new one, but most of them it's like 20 different illustrators, which I've never had before, which is pretty neat. Yeah, and they go together pretty well too. So.
Bob, right here.
Could you comment on self-publishing versus traditional publishing?
Sure. I have self-published a few books, and all of my son's books, and a couple of books by other authors. One is called Unlock Congress, about how Congress has failed and why, and what we can do to improve the situation, specific notions how to improve that. Another one's called The Gravity Well, about why it's so important to continue our deep space program. I feel like these are nonpartisan books about these subjects. But I've also self-published my own stuff, and I feel that it used to be that there was some sort of stigma attached to self-publishing, like you couldn't get published by a traditional publisher, so you had to self-publish. I don't believe that's the case anymore. Technology has changed to the extent that it's so easy to do now, and frankly, people, I believe, don't care or know who the publisher is of a book. They're just impressed that you wrote a book, and self-publishing, there's some pros and cons to the whole thing. If you can get a traditional publisher, that's great. That all you have to do is be creative, write the book, and they take care of the rest. Without going into the financial aspect of things, though, you would be shocked at how little percentage authors get of books that are sold. It's $18 book. I might get 70 cents. I mean, it's shocking. And that's if you sell out your advance in the first place. Traditional publishing, you could get a big advance. I haven't quite graduated to that point yet. But you get a small percentage of books sold. Self-publishing, you get to keep just about everything once you've taken care of printing costs and whatever you have to pay for. But you're probably going to sell fewer books. But you have total control over the design, the layout, the cover, the price point, all of that stuff. So there are pros and cons to the whole thing, but I think self-publishing is great. It's such a much more democratic thing. If you have another hour, I'll start complaining about the traditional publishing gauntlet, but we don't have that time. But self-publishing, I think, is great. The tough part is that it's so easy nowadays that there's so much white noise out there that it's hard to rise above that white noise for your book. There's something like 2 million books published a year, something like that. I mean, it's crazy. But I think it's a great avenue for anyone, and I'm happy and grateful to have done that as part of my career too.
Well, let's thank the worst miniature golf player in the world for coming and speaking at the Clinton School. Brad, thank you so much for coming. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.